Good afternoon and welcome to the history-making, record-breaking, first ever in the history of Australs debate off the 12th local regular team and first regular Please welcome Sabri, YUU1! Please welcome Affirmative, IGNOU, RAV! Please welcome your illustrious panel from the Australian National University and the University of New South Wales, Jordyn Gibson! On the other side of the panel, from International Islamic University, Banun, Sabri! And your chair today, from Macquarie University and now the University of the Union, Udai, Kamath! All teams, please leave the microphone on. It will stay on, don't turn it on or off between your speeches. We've got a table here, it should be in the right position. And please don't fall off the stage, otherwise best of luck to both teams and hand you over to the chair.
Thank you, everyone. It is an honour to chair what is the first death match in Australian history. So we will get straight into things. So, first Affirmative, without further ado, I invite you to commence the debate.
Audible, visible, clear, ready? The most important thing in this debate is peaceful transition of power. Look at what happened to Iraq after Saddam Hussein. You had ISIS and a number of other factions taking into power because of the power vacuum that exists. You look at what happened in Syria after the fleeing of Bashar al-Assad. You have HTS and a number of other factions that includes Druze, Alawites and a number of other groups that are still fighting for power. It's a normal average person that is suffering through all of this, but we solve for all of this on the comparative. There are three parts of the model. But I have to note one clarification, right? The motion says we should grant amnesty as opposed to offer amnesty, which means this debate concerns a world in which the said dictators offered to step down or accepted to step down. This is important because the implication of this is we don't have to prove a separate burden on why these dictators will agree to step down because they already did so, which is what the motion assumes. Then there are three parts of this model, which are simply the three conditions we impose for stepping down and giving amnesty to them and fleeing them safely to an external country. The first is you should not be involved politically, even to the extent of even making public appearances, which means the fear behind this would take the possibility of them having a proxy regime down after the transfer of power. The second is you should hand over proofs and evidences of all the war crimes and human rights violations that you did, and the implication of this is twofold. First, UN can commit investigation on the people that facilitated this as opposed to the leader itself. Sure, the leader is insulated, but all of the other people can still be punished, or at least the truths will come out in the worst case. And second, the political capital for the existing state apparatus to keep justifying the regime despite the releasing of these files will be harder, and hence the transfer of power has more solvency on our side. The third is you should facilitate as a dictator who's going to move on democratic elections and allow cosmopolitan institutions entities like UN to come in and international watchdogs to come in and have media freedom for transparency to happen during elections. And when you do it, you get out, you're offered amnesty. Why would a dictator even want to accept an amnesty or come friend to an amnesty in the first place? There are a couple of instances for this, and it's important for the debate to explain the counterfactual. The first is possibly this dictator has committed a lot of war crimes and human rights violations, which means the populace is presumably extremely angry and pissed off at the dictator, and there would be some instance that happened like the student revolution in Bangladesh or the Alawite massacre in Syria and whatever, right? But any critical mass that is getting formed for this revolution is what the reason for these dictators to be afraid of. When these dictators are afraid, and when they know that this is a ticking time bomb in terms of the revolution gaining more and more momentum, and that's when they go ahead and ask for an amnesty in the first place. The second is, in any regime, there are always competing factions and militias trying to take power, especially in a dictatorship. For example, HTS in Assad, Syria, PLO in Lebanese Civil War in 1974, all of them tried to take power. At a point, these other ethnic groups are oppressed and they are left out of the government, or other ethnic groups simply want to take more power or be more represented. And this means when there is a constant shift in the military dominance that the state has, and the rebel faction is constantly gaining predominance in their move towards the capital, that's when the dictator is presumably desperate. The implication of all of this is twofold. First, transfer of power is inevitable, but it happens after a long time. The second, but the reason why amnesty becomes a deal breaker when this is a ticking time bomb, as opposed to Op can weaponize this by saying, if it's a ticking time bomb, if they are desperate, we have leverage over them anyways, to ask them to step down without offering amnesty. This is because of the sheer fact that if they surrender now, they're convicted now, they have to face the brunt of whatever they did now. But if they have butchery of military to the revolutionaries, have butchery between the military and the competing factions, they can stay in power possibly for the next 3 to 5 years or 5 to 10 years in a violent government, just so that they can survive or they can be there in the first place. And this intermediate harm is what this debate is all about. Then 3 premises. The first is what does this dictator do when they are not offered this amnesty, given this is the circumstance. This covers both the instances of the dictator retaining power and the dictator being fleed out or being killed in the first place. We are coming to the first instance now. There are 3 things. First, this dictator literally can facilitate butchery between the state military forces and competing factions in the best case, or innocent people are revolutionaries in the worst case. This is bad because of 2 reasons. First, it's the innocent people that are getting killed. At a point, you have these militias and the state military forces fighting each other, and this doesn't happen in dedicated places. This happens in urban warfare. This happens in most strategic of places, which are in turn the economic centers that have most population that are encompassed in these countries. Which then means a lot of people die as an instance. The second is just that when state is constantly on a butchery with these factions, that just means you go ahead and are not able to give the basic services to people, and hence this means people are deprived of what they would have gotten even under a dictatorship. The second is that you crack down on a blanket sense among people or specific ethnicities in the worst case, or people in general in the best case. This is because of 2 reasons. The first is these militias hide behind people like what Hamas is doing in Palestine, which means they have a justification to blanket bombing, and they have incentive to blanket bombing because eradicating this competing threat to power is more important to them than them going ahead and doing all of this that might have a lesser effectiveness. The second is even if these militias don't do guerrilla warfare, or even if these revolutionaries don't do things like this, there is far more incentive for them to just blanket bomb people like what Saddam Hussein did in terms of dropping chemical bombs to Kurds in 1990s. Because of the sheer fact that they don't want these people to join these militias, they don't want these people to join these revolutionaries, and that's actually why you preemptively start doing this instead of reactively doing an attack when these dictators are desperate in the first place. The worst case, even when the dictator loses and gets killed, it doesn't solve the problem because of 3 reasons. The first is these competing factions always have a power to take, have an incentive to grab power, and they keep fighting with each other, which means it exacerbates all the harmful impacts that I told earlier to a much more extent when there is no power. The second is essential state services are neglected to people, and upon which there is no authority that they can hold accountable to. Even if the dictator is not accountable, they have basic incentive to serve these people to a bare minimum extent. But in terms of vacuum in the government, there is absolutely no one who does so, and all you're left with is ruins. The third is even if a competing faction comes into power, there is no change in the extent of dictatorship or extent of power monopoly that they have, which means they have to explain why the transition of power will be better, or why there is any more effective mechanism for you to make them step down. The second thing that I want to note is just in terms of the comparative to this, why will the democratic elections be effective? 3 reasons. First, every faction that is fighting for power now have a huge downside risk of not getting any power at all because they think this is stalemate, or they know this war has been going for a long time. What this then means is that they have certain lecture of power, and of course they can win elections in some regions as opposed to a total capture of power, which means the expected value of cumulative power that they can hold for every faction is far higher in a a coalition that they can be in a legitimate democratic government without the downside of violence, risk, and death, loss of lives of their own cadre. The second is just that we prevent such another another dictatorship from happening in turn because of three reasons. The first is there is no critical mass to justify such a similar dictatorship, because of the sheer fact that you have this as a precedent that is public to people, because from model you have already handed over the evidence, which in turn is public. The second is there is no middle echelon, or there's no one who is willing to facilitate the operations of this new dictator, because they know they will be criminalized because these leaders in turn have amnesty. The third is there's no nostalgia effect that you can create. You can't make this dictator a martyr.
Despite affirmative side's semantic tricks and trying to say that this is about offering or granting or anything else, this debate is actually about which is the best and most effective way to get these dictators to step out of the power and actually stop the harms. First, about framing up these dictators, I think there are two things that are incredibly important in this debate. One is that these dictators are already likely to be the weakest ones that don't have that secure access to power as they did before. This is specifically because if these are strong dictators that have immense control over their apparatuses, probably this means that they have no reason to accept this offer in the first place, and therefore it is likely a context in which opposition political parties or social movements are very active and very strong. The second characteristic of these dictators that are relevant to this round is that obviously these are the most harmful dictators. They are the ones that do things like humanitarian crimes, active violence, and then mismanagement of the economy and the country as a whole, and therefore this ought to be punished. And with this frame in mind, I think our counterfactual leads to three things. One is that you're going to be funding and supporting domestic civil movements and opposition parties instead of going to that dictator and granting that dictator amnesty. The second thing you can also do is do things like sanctions that target the security and economic apparatuses of that state and that dictator. The third thing is that the third thing that is also intrinsic to our model is things like harsh punishment after you actually get that dictator out of power. So you're going to sever ties to important political figures. You're also going to confiscate a lot of the economic resources and the capacity that they have. You're also going to give them things like prison sentences, or in the worst case scenario, just kill them. I'm fine with that. Then, there are two things to prove under this counterfactual. One is that this counterfactual is likely and we can actually do this. This is very simple. Because this is already a strong momentum and impetus to out this dictator as soon as this debate actually happens on the affirmative side as well. I think the international community or the ICC or whoever is capable of doing this policy is also quite equally capable and willing to do these sanctions and harsh punishments and funding of opposition. But this is also likely to be effective for three reasons. One is that these dictators, as I framed before, are likely to be the ones that are already quite weak. But the second thing is that economic sanctions are the ones that target the critical sources of power. Because when you think about it, the dictator's sources of power is promising goods and resources to critical allies in exchange for their security and their own power. This means that at the point at which you target these economic sources of power, it is very likely to work against that dictator. The third thing is that at the point at which economic sanctions start hitting, or opposition political parties, these opposition political parties and civil movements gain more momentum because obviously there's less support for that dictator because of the failure of the economy. With that said, and the end conclusion of this counterfactual is that we also have good methods of getting this dictator out of power, which are very, very likely to be effective and likely to happen in the first place. Then, the first argument we're going to push in this speech is a principled argument. It is incredibly simple. These dictators have done bad things and therefore they should be punished as a result. What have they done? One is things like huge humanitarian crimes, just killing people and oppressing minorities, or things like the exploitation of economic resources and the people and the labor of the people. They also go through things like active violence and political purges in order to keep their security. And they've also done things like terribly mismanaging the economy and the country. And these are all visceral harms that these dictators have done. These people ought to be punished for their crimes for 3 reasons. One is the simple principle idea that if you've taken away another person's agency, you should be punished and your agency should be taken away from you as well. But the second thing is that these people are the people that have taken away people's agency at the largest and highest scale, and therefore the necessity of the principle punishment goes up as well. The third thing is that this kind of principle should be applied to everyone consistently, whether you be at the top of a dictatorship or you be a person on the ground. And therefore these people should face punishment regardless of what happens later on down the line. The second reason as to why this actually is more necessary is because this is the only way in which you can checks and balance against these people. These contexts are uniquely a context where there's an absence of domestic structures and criminal justice system that can actually apply this principle very well. And therefore the actor, whether that be the international community of the United States or the ICC, is the only one who can provide this principle justice, and therefore we should be doing this regardless of any of the impacts. This is a principal harm that they have to contend with. These dictators are horrible people that have done bad things, and therefore they should be punished. Leaving them unpunished leads to a very visceral sense of injustice that cannot be contended on affirmative side. Second argument I'm going to talk about is a practical one. The first thing I'm going to say under this argument is that dictators are capable of maintaining power channels. Because on the affirmative side, you have little things like isolation and confiscation of these resources. The first is that these dictators are likely to keep power. They have the incentive, because obviously these dictators are greedy and power-hungry individuals by nature. That's what makes them dictators. But the second is that they have the capacity to do so because they already have good and mutually beneficial relationships with key people like oligarchs and company heads and stuff like that. And also, the cooperatives and the people that cooperate with these dictators also do not have an active reason to turn away from these relationships insofar as they know that these dictators can provide them goods and political and social goods later on down the line. What does this power retention look like? I think even if you take this dictator out of politics, they are likely to retain things like influence over the media. They also have control over things like companies and vast amounts of economic resources and like natural resources like that as well. In the worst case, they also have some layer of control and influence over security apparatuses like the police and the military. And it's very hard to tackle this kind of vast amount of networks with the surface level limitations on affirmative policy. So maybe they can't make public appearances, but the key nuance of this argument is that they still retain a vast amount of influence that is still going to be incredibly harmful. Why is this bad? Number one is that economic exploitation of individuals continues in a sense that benefits these dictators, and this is a both principled and practical harm. But the second thing that happens is that it is incredibly likely that these people or the people around them are resurging to power because they have control over things like the media. They can retrospectively paint them in a better light, for example, or it gives them a ground for them to form political dynasties and political parties that are closer to them. So at the point at which we don't want these dictators to resurge, I think the not punishing them and letting them keep their power, which is incredibly likely, is something that is incredibly bad. The second thing to talk about under this argument is that it just changes the calculus of politicians later on down the line as well. Note that this policy is not about one specific case, it is a general policy direction to be applied to all dictators across the world. This means that at the point at which future leaders have a cost-benefit analysis of being more democratic, or they have to make the decision to do these human rights violations, for example, the harsh punishment signals to these dictators what happens. They see past examples of dictators being killed and punished and fucked over and being stripped of all of their resources and connections, and therefore this provides a unique and strong disincentive to actually opt into the worst behaviors that world leaders can opt into. At the end of this debate, you should believe that we have a better way of, we have a better and very good and effective way of taking these dictators out of power. But even if you do not believe any of this analysis, it is still important that these horrible people are punished for their crimes and the pain that they have caused. Very proud to negate.
The nature of moral imperative is such that you always want to protect people who are innocent because they haven't committed any harm in the society. At the point when you sanction a nation, you make sure that morally innocent people have no access to goods, services like oil and food, and therefore they suffer on a daily basis. They suffer from malnutrition because they can no longer buy food that possibly guarantees them protein and nutrition, and many of the children will die. At the point when you fund political opponents like rebel groups, they go on to war and they make sure that there's a lot of conflict and innocent people die in crosshairs. Their entire policy makes sure that innocent people die, and these are people who have done absolutely no harm, but these are people who are extremely oppressed and therefore possibly have more moral agency than everyone else out there. There are two comparatives I want to show here. One, on our side of the house, these people do not die because you make sure that you give amnesty and this dictator goes out of the power. After all the harms that they allege, and if you take them at their best, that this dictator will be able to get some political power, this possibly still is outweighed by the harms that are caused by sanctions, where people simply cannot get access to basic resources because they haven't proven the likelihood of this sanction succeeding, given it hasn't succeeded in most of the world, and I will prove why that's true. But apart from that, on our side of the house, we make sure that the dictators leave power and possibly there is a transition to democracy. I'll explain to you why this is likely. Even if you don't buy it from the model, I think you should, but I will explain that likelihood as well. As long as that is true, there are a lot of living beings who are going to die at the point when you do not implement this policy, and these are also moral actors that you need to take care of. I have absolutely no reasoning as to why this dictator should be punished because they have given absolutely no moral reasoning. Their moral reasoning is that dictator is bad, we should punish them. I guess there are quite a lot many people involved who are likely to die in the near future if you do not follow our policy, and therefore these are people with moral agency. Every practical argument has a principle underlying to it, and therefore all the benefits that we prescribe also possibly create significant moral benefits that you should weigh over everything that they say. There are two other things that I'm going to do first. One, I'm going to explain to you why sanctions never succeed and why they lead to significant amount of harms. First, sanctions very often simply push the dictators to concentrate power with them and resources with them rather than distributing it to people because they are self-serving and there is absolutely no accountability. So at the point when you put sanctions and dictators can't get a lot of oil, they possibly can still get some from belligerent regimes like China and a couple of other friendlies. They will make sure that all this remains with them. So all the oil that comes to the country remains with them and isn't distributed to people. All the food that comes to the country remains with them and isn't distributed to people. For example, I think Myanmar is a country that has been sanctioned since 1960s, and the dictators that is an armed force very often is a militia that is extremely powerful. All their children have a lot of power, a lot of money. They have the most luxurious lifestyle because they are able to concentrate this power given there is absolutely no accountability while people are dying and they keep committing exploitation. This has never worked simply because dictators have the power to channel all resources towards them. So they are not exploited at all. Even if they go for the best case analysis, which is individual sanctions, the best you can do is cancel their passport access in multiple countries. They can still remain in their luxurious mansions and make sure that they live the happiest life possible. The second thing opposition wants to do is simply fund opposition militia to make sure this dictator is fought with. I do not see the benefit of this. Firstly, they have to prove the likelihood of success. But what is the cost of this success? When you find the dictator, he possibly has an army and he will kill a bunch of people, he will drop bombs like Vishwa says. So even if there is success, a bunch of people die. And even if there is success, who says this militia will transition to democracy? Why will this militia not take power themselves and become a dictator themselves? This is something that they never really answer. If this militia is funded, there is absolutely no incentive as to why this militia will turn into a democracy. The only mechanism they might have later on, which I will respond to, is that, well, there is US and UN. Very often a lot of the third-party countries only care about their own benefits. So very often what they will do is they will simply make an agreement with this militia so that they can get resources from this nation or get favorable outcomes from this nation. Creating transition to a democracy in a nation is extremely difficult. They would possibly be happy with a puppet even if they are huge. So even if that is an argument OP can make, I'm not sure if there is a clear incentive and capacity to transition into a democracy if an alternative militia wins. And therefore they have absolutely no solvency on their side of the house. But as long as they cannot prove that they will bring the dictator down, their principle has no solvency because it's a principle that is dependent upon an impact that you will be able to bring the dictator down and punish him. Even if the dictator is really weak, they have to prove the solvency of it. Why is he asking for an amnesty? Obviously, because the possibility of you leaving your country with your family and friends and living a luxurious life is still good, rather than going for an actual war where you might die and lose in 5 years. This is a threat as to why he's asking for amnesty. does not mean that he will absolutely fail without giving a fight, and that's something that they have to do in order to achieve that principle. What happens through an amnesty? They are correct. Very often, these are people who want to take some economic resources, but they are incorrect in pointing out that they stay in this country. This is a country where they hate so many, where they have killed so many people, where they have violated so many human rights. No dictator ever have stayed in their own country after fleeing. Sheikh Hasina flew into Delhi. I think most of the dictators in the world, they just fly into another nation where they can be granted amnesty and they are treated in a friendly manner and aren't be going to attack by a bunch of revolutionaries later, because of which they just go away with all their friends and family without any connection to this nation. Second, do they take some economic resources? I think they do. They possibly take a bunch of money, but this is never going to be enough to like bankrupt an entire nation. At best, they will possibly take money that will sustain them and their family for the next 2 generations in a new country, and that is possibly what you allow under an amnesty deal, because they are assuming that the amnesty deal will be super unreasonable. Their assertion is this amnesty deal will be done when this dictator is possibly not at his peak of the power, which means that we are unsure as to why he will take half the economy with him and he will be able to make a deal where all his cronies retain power. I don't think that's true. If he doesn't have a lot of power right now and if he is so desperate, he will possibly go for a deal that does not grant him everything. If all of that is true, on our side of the house, we make sure that this deal is possibly done in a good manner. But look at all their mechanisms. Their counterfactual depends upon US, EU, and all of them being involved. If there are third parties being involved, they will possibly be able to strike a good deal. There are a few reasons as to why transition to democracy happens in a good way on our side of the house. One, at the point when the dictator himself is telling people that he's going to resign, a lot of the other fractions are willing to put trust in him. But also there are external actors who haven't committed those harms yet. Possibly there are a bunch of human rights organizations involved who are constantly coming and reporting in this country. Multiple other leaders are possibly engaging with this, and this is getting international media coverage. And therefore other fractions trust this. Second, at the point when there is no clarity that this dictator is going to resign, fractions obviously do not have this trust and they continue to attack, and therefore it leads to large-scale violence. But now they see that they have a chance at power, even if not as the prime minister of this country, possibly within their own state and province where they have quite a lot of popularity, and this chance at power looks like good to them. Third, at the point when all of them have to come together and negotiate, they have no other option but to arrive at a democracy, because that is the only way they can make sure that there is stability within the regime. But very often, the external powers who are intervening have to justify their intervention, and the only way to justify their intervention in this way, where they actively intervene in a nation, is to bring democracy back, because that is possibly something that UN allows you to do, apparently these days, but also this is the justification that has been taken so many times, so they have to make sure that there is a constitution. But almost all dictators in the past, even the colonial one, while leaving, have generally gathered all the other fractions that existed and have created a constituent assembly. Given this is something that has happened before again and again, this is also something that is likely to be followed, because this is the political framework that everyone has seen and everyone borrows from, and therefore it's quite likely that fractions come together, create a constitution and create an election, and all the benefits that occur as a result of it is a peaceful transition of power and benefits to human beings. In there, they will not die. Proud to work.
The first thing I'll talk about is what will the amnesty will actually look like, because I think that as much they say set more conditions on this amnesty, obviously the dictators are less likely to comply. So for example, if you're doing things like economical confiscation or reparative duties to the victims, it is highly unlikely that these people are signing that agreement, which means that this tells you that inequality structurally to, for example, the victims being left out and people being angry is highly unlikely to be solved or reparated or paid back. And secondly, I will also point out that the bargaining power is likely on the dictator, because you already traded off the principle for citizens for the urgency of the problem. That means that the dictators are more likely to, for example, threaten other people for the actions that they describe, like for example, casting more direct violence on the civilians that they have, which means that even if they do not do that action, now dictators can use that as a bargaining chip, which is comparatively a much lower bar than actually going out and killing the opposition party that might also risk their life. And thirdly, I think that flying to a different country, that granting amnesty is obviously not the part of the debate. We're discussing whether granting amnesty in dictators is something that we should morally do or not do. Obviously, if our side also grants amnesty in some kind of nation, then this debate doesn't happen at best. The second thing I'll talk about is what actions the dictators are likely to take, because they say that they are doing bad things in the status quo, like casting direct violence. This is highly unlikely because of 3 reasons. Number one, I think that direct violence leads to harder opposition pushback. And I will note that one thing, that they're saying that opposition parties will be also likely to be bad people. I think that this is highly unlikely, because if you're an opposition party, or for example an opposition faction in a dictatorship, you're more likely to depend on the compliance of the citizens. For example, how much the citizens are helping you. Do they provide them food and raw water when you are actually casting the anti-governmental movements, or when they are providing, for example, people that are needed for your opposition party's faction, which means that it is highly likely that this opposition party is something that at least the citizens are people who are trusting upon, which means that the transition forces symmetrically is some person that is legitimate in both sides of the house. I think that the fact that you are casting direct violence to these people leads for the opposition party to also take desperate measures, and if this dictators really prioritize their own survival well, they will know the fact that maybe casting violence against these people and starting an actual war is the worst decision that they can do. Secondly, I think that there could be also things like incompliance for the security apparatus, because even if you're structurally oppressing people, I think that if you're a soldier, shooting a civilian is actually quite a hard bar for you to do. So for example, when South Korea casted martial law, that's why the military do not really comply on shooting the citizens, because they thought that that was morally illegitimate. Even if you're inside the military, it is highly unlikely that people are shooting down the individuals, and that is the most likely thing that people will do. But thirdly, if you're shooting down people, this gives more legitimacy for external actors to intervene, because I think that people are already inside the status quo quite skeptical in direct intervention in both the US and the United Nations because of all the things that happen. But I think that when you're intervening with humanitarian issues, this is when there's a tipping point when the media and the international society conceives this kind of thing as something that is legitimate to do. So I think that if you're a dictator that preserves your life as your first priority, like they themselves characterize, they going down and shooting citizens inside the status quo is largely unlikely to happen. Then they talk about the counterfactual as something that's ineffective. I'll prove you why it is not. The first thing I'll just imply is that they themselves are conceding that these counterfactuals are mutually exclusive, because they're attacking this counterfactual, so our benefits are something that is still standing. The response that I will give is that number one, they say that sanctions never work because they just concentrate resources. The first thing is that I think that monetary seizures are something that is a direct interest conflict with the security apparatus. For example, if you're a military or if you're a police, obviously how much money, how much bribery that your governments give to you is something that is important. For example, if you're actively confiscating your money from international assets, if you're having less monetary seizures, if the dictators by, for example, having external pressure on your sources of money, it is also a direct reason for the security apparatus to comply less and feel less security inside the nation. But secondly, even if the citizens don't, even if the dictator don't care, the economical oligarchies care about this, because the corporations, they are the investor stability that they care about, rely on the fact that there will be corporate capital funded into your corporation. Once in a moment when there are sanctions, those kind of things are being threatened, and that's why these people will ask the government for a better choice to do. The better claim that they make is that this hurts citizens, so this is bad. But I think that I'll point out that the margin is extremely speculative. Already the nation is taking away your agency and freedom and your life and your family away from you. I think that even if there are a short-term harm, for example, creating sanctions, and at worst case the civilians dies, I think that the margin of the harm is something that is largely symmetric on the both sides. And I'll just point out one weighting, that if their goal is to prove that intervening and removing the dictator is an exclusive way on their side, we are also completely fine with assassinating the dictator or the leader that happened in certain cases. So I think that if their path to victory is proving the exclusivity, they largely fail. And then let's talk about the transition, because that's the main way that they want to win the debate. They say that the transition will be bad and good in their side because there are opposing factions gathering up for elections. I think that this is largely symmetric on both sides. Obviously, there will be immense amount of civic attention to the new leader, and we already characterize why the opposition faction will be likely the ones that already have enough citizens' interest inside inside our world as well. And the actors that are intervening, for example, giving amnesty in your world and militarily intervening in your world is both the same people. If it is United States they care about, they have same perverse incentive that they characterize. I'm not sure why a single analysis that they talk about their own case is something that is weighing inside this debate. Let me actually give you the way what is the difference inside the transition process. I think that what this team creates is a massive civil distrust. The person that killed my family, the person that killed humongous amount of people are not being punished and escaping the nation and going to US and having a luxurious life. This means that citizens no longer trust that there is a legitimate process in my government. What does this result? Number one, obviously there are much more less civil compliance. For example, they don't really know why they're paying taxation. For example, they don't comply to CJS and rely on extrajudiciary measures because they think that these things are not retributing for their case. Secondly, there will be obviously more and more nepotism because if these individuals are not being punished, obviously this becomes a signaling impact to all other people that are inside your regions. For example, if you're a corporation, you're more likely to believe that there will be always a leeway for yourself. But thirdly, I think that this is the most crucial tipping point. You create political apathy. If you don't think that your votes are answered, if the leader is not representing yourself, people lose attention to the media, people lose attention and distrust to the control that you already have. That's when things like identity politics arrive. If I don't believe United States, if I don't believe any other actors, that's when I believe on my own ethnicity and the politicians give you the more populist incentive. You don't care about the media when you think that it is controlled. You don't care about elections when there are individuals that are not being punished. That's why casting active retribution is the logical priority for these people, believing on the system once more and believing that the politics will give you something that is legitimate once more. But lastly, they conveniently do not engage on our principle that is the most crucial part of the debate. They say that more people are dying, so utilitarianly this is better. 3 reasons why CJS is something that is fundamentally not utilitarian. Number one, we don't convict someone who is 80% guilty, or for example, we don't use unlawfully acquired evidences because we think that justice principles are something that is overriding pragmatic calculations. Even if this saves more people by, for example, torturing a person or a victim for evidence, we don't think that that is legitimate because that is not paying back for the actions that these people have done. But secondly, also you have a special restitutive incentive, obligation for the victim, which is independent of consequential considerations. For example, maybe if I stole somebody, like rich person's cars and give it back to the most vulnerable people inside the society, maybe that is a good thing, but the CJS asks you to return it back to the rich person, which was the car owner, because if you has uniquely failed the victim, then you owe an obligation to pay back those kind of psychological demands or pay back for those kind of actions that you have done. And they themselves said that this kind of things is the priority that citizens think. And this is the moment when your dictators are a primary interest for everyone inside your society, it is a likely tipping point that people do not trust the system and the CJS's principle are also not met. Either in principle, either in transition, either removing the dictator, props negate.
Thank you. The second named speaker, invite the third speaker.
Audible? Yeah, this works.
When the British left their colonies, people did not say, oh my God, we did not punish these Britishers. People said, oh my God, we are free. We can finally have control of ourselves. We can finally establish a democracy, and they're happy about the freedom they get. Because the reason they fought these dictators was the dictatorship itself. They wanted freedom, and this is exactly what they got. They're happy about it. Even if some people would like retribution, I would argue that these are the more violent elements in the society. And the point at which you allow like these dictators to, you allow like the democracy to not be established, these violent elements can get even more violent in society because they want even more democratic like revolution and stuff like that. So on their side as well, even if you want democracy, it could likely just be the case that people fight harder for it. Their argument is that this leads to a civil distress because of it when you don't punish dictators and civilians don't comply with the policies. The problem is this assumes that the situation remains the same. In our model, we clearly establish a path to victory here. We tell you how the atrocities stop immediately, why all the aid comes in because all the countries are now trusting that the aid will reach the people instead of just being eaten up by the dictators and their cronies. And not just that, you also get democratic elections happening immediately. So when you get democratic elections happening, people feel represented. They talk about their issues and they ask for demands. But not just that, they take part in the political process. On the comparative, even if you are able to like impose sanctions, these people are never able to take part in the dictatorship because they are not represented in democracy. They can't talk to their political advocates and they cannot like elect leaders that are going to represent them. They live in a world where the dictator deals with the sanctions by dealing with states that would be happy with sanctions on themselves. So this dictator is completely cut off from the US. They like collaborate with other countries like Myanmar. They collaborate with North Korea. Maybe countries like China or Russia, which are more than happy to provide them resources. The resources which they use to then tax the people and then oppress them further. So on their side, there is no end to solvency, but on our side, what you get is a clear path to establishing a democracy where people feel significantly happier. They feel but like they're part of like the democratic ideals that they have been fighting for, and they do help establish a government. This is exactly why people don't get frustrated and just all of a sudden start like civil revolutions on their side and start like on our side and start like not complying with the civilian reconstruction. Ops says that corporations are going to push the dictator to comply with sanctions, but this assumes that these corporations cannot deal with the sanctions in other ways. I think Anshuman clearly explains to you how these corporations can just push the dictator to have like deals made with other countries who can obviously provide the same kind of economic support. But not just that, I would argue that these corporations go further and try to insulate themselves from other actors that are pushing for democracies, and these corporations then actively want the dictators to establish themselves with other dictatorial regimes which are more than happy to provide these dictators with resources that is going to help suppress the people in these states. So there's no end, there's no solvency on their side either. But I would argue that this goes further. The point at which you live in a dictatorship where there are sanctions, you live in a dictatorship where if you don't get any food, you can't ask for a change because you're not politically represented, and you cannot stop the dictatorship either. The only way in which you can stop the dictatorship on their side under these sanctions is when you're going hungry stomach every single day in front of, like, let's say, the dictator's house and protesting, which likely leads to violence, which likely leads to a lot of clashes where people do die, and these people die desperately because they have no food whatsoever. On our side, these people get political representation, they feel happier, they do comply with the civil infrastructure that they're able to create, and they're able to create institutions that represent them. On our side, clear path to democracy, clear path to civilians taking part in this democracy. On their side, you get sanctions, which further incites these democracies to become, these dictatorships to become more dictatorial and suppress people further, kill them more so that these people don't have revolutions. By this point, I think we are winning the debate. I'm just going to quickly cover 4 things in this speech now. The first thing I'm going to explain is why people are involved in negotiations on our side, and when these people are like involved in negotiations, they automatically push for democracies. There are 3 reasons for this. The first is that the third party countries that are putting in their resources to establish democracies in their side want to show that they have succeeded, that their programs have been successful, and because they want to probably create like some sort of economic bridges between this country and the other one so that they can gain some resources from them and have economic advantages. The example of this is simply US, when it oftentimes aims to push proxies out so that it can get like it pushes proxies out so that it can get it can have like democracies in these countries so that it can easily establish like free trade deals without having like pushback against having relationships with dictatorial regimes. This is also conditional for aid, so these countries oftentimes end up getting aid on our side. Insofar as these new democracies that come up want aid, they do try to create like good democracies. They do try to create like civilian infrastructure that ensures that people are represented. The second reason is that people who are leading these revolts want legitimacy, and they want a government, given that this is what they have been fighting for. Dictatorships have often oppressed them, which means it is in their natural incentive to make sure that they establish a democracy. So all of the opposition groups that they're going to fund on their side, like NGOs and opposition parties, have a natural incentive to push for like democracies on our side. And the third is that the new leaders that come into power are again scared of the revolutions that could happen again, and they don't want third parties, which are oftentimes bad actors, to grab power in these nations, which means they oftentimes are ready to lose their status, even if these are elite political parties and elite have elite political status. They're still more likely to concede this power because they would rather live in a democracy where they have some power instead of having no power, and these people still push for democracy slowly. What happens when you don't grant amnesty? There are 2 things that happen. The first is that you likely get prosecution by international courts on their side. This is exactly how they say they're going to hold this dictator accountable and going to put them in jail. The problem is this is ineffective. There have been like 6 prosecutions by the International Court of Justice since 2007, and the reason for this is that you need like incrementally high amount of evidence in order to punish a dictator, because the evidence that has to be submitted is evidence beyond reasonable doubt. But the problem is most of the in most of these situations, the dictators obviously like destroy all of the evidence because they don't want people to claim that there is a genocide happening. Which means if none of the evidence is kept, these dictators are unlikely to be punished for their human rights violation. So on their side, you might want to push for like prosecution, but they don't explain how you get the solvency of actually getting these dictators prosecuted. You must reduce the reduce the value of the impact that they're trying to claim. This is the first way in which things fold out if you don't grant amnesty. The second is that this dictator probably gets killed by revolutionaries because this side wants to fund NGOs and opposition groups, but they don't explain why they'll remain peaceful. If these dictators are killed by the revolutionary, I would argue that this creates a power vacuum. There are three problems with this. The first problem is that when there's a power vacuum, it is in the natural interest of a lot of other parties, given that there is no stable structure to have democracy happen. It's in the natural incentive to take power. So oftentimes the army takes over. The army itself can create a dictatorship. There is no solvency whatsoever on their side because you can't hold the army accountable either, given that it can just kill you down with guns immediately. The second is that the revolutionaries create a suppressive government themselves because they were repressed by the dictator, and they just want to create a government where they feel they are represented. And the third is that you do have elections happening maybe sometime in the future, but these elections happen quite hastily because there was no peaceful path to democratization. There was no peaceful structure to how democracy would happen, and these elections, even if they happen, might not happen in the most fair way. Which means people are never represented on their side either. If not just that, these elections oftentimes lead to people killing each other, given that a lot of funds are put to opposition groups and NGOs on their side. I just want to do the third and fourth thing now, which is just way as to why living another day under a dictatorship is just worse than anything out there. There are four reasons for this. The first is that people die every day under protest and under prosecution. This is just unimaginable atrocities happening. If their claim is that, oh, people shouldn't die, I think it just happens more on their side and you shouldn't live in such a world. The second is that the government entrenches its power further because it's able to gain resources. They themselves say that this dictator probably has media control. This dictator probably has companies to a certain extent under their control. If that's the case, then this dictator can further entrench their power and suppress people and weaken minorities in the future, which makes revolution or democracy even more difficult to more unlikely to happen in the future. The third is that this dictatorship presents no alternative to these people except for violence happening, which I would argue forces these people to commit crimes that they're uncomfortable with, they're unhappy with, and something that genuinely makes them sad. So living in a dictatorship isn't a good thing. And the fourth is that it just requires more time for you to establish your own democratic institutions which aim to safeguard people. If institutional building happens much later on their side, people aren't granted the civil liberties they should be. In next world, the worst case is, but it's still possible that dictators attempt to concentrate power. Insofar as they do this, they cut off resources from people, they kill minorities, they have genocide. That's obviously a bad thing.
Thank you. The third affirmative speaker, the third negative speaker with the substantive portion of this debate.
I just want to clarify a few things before we go on to our clash. The first thing is that just because you grant amnesty doesn't mean that the dictators will accept any bad conditions, like reparative actions. I think this is well explained by Wonjae. Either the fact that you are granting amnesty means that dictatorships has a bargaining power. You are stepping down with amnesty should be more beneficial over the power you are holding right now, politically and economically. That is the reason why the likelihood of the citizens feeling bad, the citizens feeling unsatisfied, the victims feeling unsatisfied is still standing in this debate. That is the reason why the principal claim that we're telling you about how these people do not deserve to get the amnesty is still standing in this debate that is not engaged by side Affirmative. But third, if it is true that amnesty will look like Affirmative characterizes, it implies that the dictator does not have much power. That is the reason why our counterfactual is likely to be equally more effective as well. The lowest burden impacts that we are having in this debate is that we signal to their political fraction. We have political efficacy that citizens are feeling, which is a prerequisite for a better transition politically. The fact that we have victims' reparation under our side is still standing. So that is the reason why, even under their best case of Affirmative, that dictators come down, this does not mean that the political transition happens perfectly. That is the reason why I'd like to prove you why democracy is unlikely under their side. And lastly, I just want to clarify that we are fine with assassinating the dictator. We are fine with kidnapping them like Maduro. That is still okay for us if we can't take away the dictatorship and then we win on the principal factors that Yuhyeok and Wonjae already explains fully. Moving on to the first clash on where how transition will actually happen under both sides. The positive mechanism that comes from Affirmative in two folds. First, on the incentive for international community to implement a healthy democracy, and on capacity that many large countries and institutions are involved. But we tell you the incentive of the capacity that they're identifying is at best symmetric on their both sides. The same actors are doing the policy on both sides. Wonjae gives you reasons why the proxy actors we are using, for instance, opposition parties or movements or etc., also have good democratic institutions. And that is generally the reason why their incentive or capacity or the mechanism that they're proving does not prove a margin in this debate and they're incomparative. But second, the reason why our transition is likely to be successful, the first thing that we tell you is that the subsidy funding we give will be under the condition of political reform. This aligns the political incentive with the opposition parties or any of the actors that are involved in this debate. That is the reason why we are the ones who have more direct control with who will have power at the next regime. That is generally the reason why the likelihood of reform happening in the beneficiary way of the incentive of the actor who's granting the amnesty or whatever is standing in this debate. The practical points that we tell you in this debate is in three folds. First, we tell you that sanctions and opposition supports, we can also kidnap and assassinate dictators. The empirical evidence of capability is like Maduro's. We have more chances of success since intervening nations likely have asymmetric intelligence. The symmetric part of the peaceful democratic transition is possible. But second, we tell you that the resurgence of dictators will not happen. This is compared to the transition process, and this is a long-term impact. But third, we also tell you about civil compliance. But generally, they then tell us about on sanctions. The second Affirmative tells us that they don't work because of alternatives like China and Iran, but the oil is not redistributed. The issue is this response is that even when sanctions are not there, there's symmetrically no incentive to redistribute, making the amount of citizen pain extremely marginal. That is the reason why their claim about innocent citizen is not proving a margin in this debate. Then we tell you that white people being happy is actually unlikely on their side. People are happy when, first, the people that want this is people which their family and children were lost by the dictators. Obviously, they have diverse interests, but retribution is likely the cognitive priority than any unintuitive things that they want to argue. But second, about people getting represented, this is more likely for actors like oligarchs and large frictions to create things like political dynasties because they don't feel the visible consequence. That is generally the reason why people are unlikely to feel happy on their side, and we told that this is a prerequisite in order to making a better reform at the end of the day. But also, just intuitively think, your family died, your life is miserable, and the dictator that made your life miserable is happy with their family having food on the table. The fact that my family doesn't have the food on the table at this very moment, but the dictator is having food on the table, makes these people feel very, very unhappy. The dissatisfaction is still high, regardless of the dictator losing the power. But second, we tell you that that is the reason why the actual punishment to the dictator is an immediate catharsis that is the lowest burden under impact that we can achieve under our side. Then that is the moment citizens can actually hope that the society can get better. This is the tipping point of individuals willing to actively engage and believe in the country. And that is generally the reason why these kind of political trust that we're proving in margin is important. Because A, the victims of the dictatorship will not trust the institution on their side. They're unwilling to rely on government institutions. That is when your society will be way more miserable because they do not believe in police on your side. That is the margin that we're proving. But second, regarding political apathy, we tell you that this is logically prior to check and balances of democracy. All in all, the short-term impact that they want to prove to us on how innocent people die is bad. We tell that this is unlikely to happen because the dictator's violence on citizens are unlikely. This is already well proven by Wonjae that is not engaged. That is generally the reason why you think it's just unlikely that there will be so many bombs under our side exclusively and people will just suddenly die. But even if you believe in this, the way that you that we give you is that, first, under the long term, when your transition cannot happen successfully, when the check and balances will be very, very low under your side because of low political efficacy, or citizens not being willing to cooperate with the institutions giving amnesty, you will have more innocent people dying out as well in the long term. This is worse because the deterrent signaling to the dictators are weak. When probably your country does not have like strong political structures, meaning that your country is quite having a volatile political structure, you are quite vulnerable to the dictatorship. You are also making innocent citizens that will die out at the end of the day. Maybe you win on the short term, but even in the long term, your society is even worse. When both sides will have innocent people under the worst case, I think the long-term number of victims under their side is likely to be bigger. The potential future victims are bigger than the finite number who have been harmed under our side. The magnitude of harm that they are able to impose to these individuals are going to be way bigger. That is during the reason why we believe that even we are willing to even in the trade-off, we believe that these kind of long-termistic transitions should be important. That is the reason why the signaling to other global dictatorships are also important, because that impacts the global infinite number of innocent citizens that are suffering. Our burden is not to achieve democracy, but to make sure that we just get rid of the worst version of dictatorship. And I think I think that is well proven under Wonjae's speech. But lastly, and then moving on to the last clash on principle. We tell you that this principle is something that is worth it. We tell you so many reasons as to why an individual should be granted on their agency. And that is the reason why if someone takes over your agency, like the dictators, they should be punished. And that is very, very important because they are harming the degree of harm that they impose to these citizens are very large. Under their side, those dictatorships do not get the reparation. Regardless of other institutions or other fractions getting the punishment or not, the fact that the person who had the biggest burden, the person who was the most visible harming individual or the most visible criminal to these citizens, that person getting the punishment is very important. And that's the reason why we went on a clear principle margin that is not engaged by side affirmative till the end of the debate. But lastly, we like to prove you why our counterfactual will still be effective under our side. Because the first thing is that we told them why these dictators are likely to be weak at the moment when they are granted amnesty. That is during the reason why our counterfactual is likely to succeed. But secondly, economic sanctions targeting critical sources of power existing. The dictator's source is promising goods resources to the allies. But third, we tell you that we will give more power to the opposition as a result. That is during the reason why we have the efficacy that is proven. Their response to our principle is that, you need to prove that your transition happened in order for your principle to stand. But we tell you why our counterfactual is likely to happen and also effective. But also, even if it's not the opposition party, we tell you that we're finally killing the dictators kidnapping the dictators like we did to Maduro. That is the reason why even if you do not believe that the margin in the transition is quite small, we win on principle, and this is the most important thing in this debate.
Thank you to the third and main speaker of that speech. I'd like to invite the negative reply speaker to conclude the negative bench.
Look how narrow affirmatives' path to victory is. They need to prove that this immediate solvency is exclusive because all of their practical impacts are hedged on the idea that we bring democracy right now. We told you that immediate solvency is inexclusive. Kidnapping your leader or assassination of leaders are also something that are actions that we can take. We empirically saw in the past, for example, in the cases of Maduro, regardless of whether that is a good decision, if they want immediate solvency, that is something that is possible. We told you also that there was asymmetric intelligence that these interventionist nations own, so it is likely that these things will be also effective. Another response for our other counterfactuals is that sanctions hurt citizens, which we already responded by telling you that, for example, seizing your bank accounts, creating more corporational volatility by things like short selling by capitals of, for example, that the United States own, are something that is the more modern way of sanctions that we use, which, for example, we use to the Russian assets that we have. But even if we say that these kind of things are harmful for the sanctions, the margin that they prove is extremely speculative inside the debate. So immediate solvency is not exclusive, but even if they say that this is something that is exclusive, we say that you are signing, we told you also that you are signing a worse deal, because we told you that the asymmetry inside this debate is actually shooting a citizen is harder than threatening to shoot your citizens. So if you are signing inside a situation where you are already trading off your principle, it is more likely that the immediate solvency that you bring in your side is something that is much more favorable in the actor of dictators. So secondly, then the impacts that they hedge on this is by talking that they have better transitions. if you actually look at your notes, the only idea that they have is these people are good people and we bring immediate democracy, so that is something that is beneficial. Which means that this claim is at best contingent on proving the first claim of exclusivity. But secondly, we also provided you why we have better side of the transition. So they said that people get to vote and that is beneficial and people will be happy. Affirmative world is when not only one but all dictators, when they get weak, can retire in an island in Bahamas. So maybe you're first happy that your dictators left, but that becomes now what happens in the global world. This is the most important principles in justice inside the round. The victims of past dictators, the current victims of current ones, and those who fight so hard to get rid of all they know are will now understand that their tyrants will never see justice. And this is when the democracy that they tell us is something that is failing. Just because of the fact that there's election do not mean that people feel the political efficacy. Elections are only instrumental when they can see a leader or taking their responsibility and getting reparated with wrong decisions that they make. The only counterclaim that they make is, oh, you don't bring justice to your leader. We actually told you numerous ways how the counterfactual is something that is effective, but even in the worst case that we're doing something like Trump, that is still fitting the burden that Affirmative tries to prove inside the debate. Where is the delta inside this debate? In practicality is inconclusive. We tell you that principled justice is the most important thing in the debate constantly throughout the bench because this is about related to agency, reparation for the victims, and retribution for the convicts. There are two responses from Affirmative. Number one, that we have better consequences, and number two, that we cannot ask justice for the leader because we don't solve it. Number two is, by the way, already disproved by telling you that we can ask justice for the leader in a very probable occasion. Obviously, there are some cases where we trade off, but we think that if this justice of the leader is something that we cannot ask in situations, it is highly unlikely that you will sign the deal of amnesty in their side as well. Secondly, we already told you why courts are not consequentialist. The principle of criminal justice is important because everyone are already guided their life by the criminal justice that you provided. The responsibility that you take should be equal to everybody. If you look at your notes, they don't have any responses to this claim, nor any weighing upon why this principle is less important than the practicals. All of their claims is contingent on proving this makes people more happy. The fact that this retribution, we provided you multiple times why this is the prior interest that citizens have. If your family is shot, if your friends are being shot and taken by the leader, everyone cares about their victims, that these people do not go to Bahamas but get actual justice. So we also weigh this principle as something that is over the practical. They don't not even respond, but also not even weigh why this doesn't matter inside this debate. We either win in the path to victory by proving that we have better transition, but even if that's not the case, we win by principle. Proud to negate.
That speech, and now to conclude the debate, I invite the affirmative reply.
They give three counter models at LO. One, sanction. Two, funding NGOs and separatist groups. Oh, they actually gave two. As long as these are the counter models, we prove to you that none of this guarantees justice or a court process. If you fund separatists, we are not sure why they would succeed. And even if they succeed, why would they just not kill the dictator and have a court process and justice process? If you sanction, not necessarily sure why this lead to a entire court where people come and give testimonies and have justice. The third counter model they come up with in DLO, which they are not allowed to, is that we are going to kidnap and kill this person. Again, how does this bring justice and rely on the principle of justice that they have been talking about? If principle is their path to victory, have they proven solvency on the principle? Because this principle has to be true in order for it to survive. However, it isn't, as we have proven in multiple instances. On sanctions, we told you that they have an incentive to concentrate power. Opt said, well, this is a dictatorship, so concentration of power is same. But look at the nuance in my speech. I said they would concentrate all the goods and services that were available to normal people, which would no longer be available because they want to make sure that they survive in the best possible luxury. Which means on our side of the house, even in the dictatorship, people can buy food. Dictator doesn't have the incentive to clog all the food to himself. On their side, this incentive exists, and therefore there is possibly a huge delta in terms of people just not having access to basic amenities and dying, and this is something they did not respond to. On funding separatists, I mean, if they want to fund only really good NGOs, we don't know why they will be able to take out the dictator. If they want to fund separatists, not sure why this lead to a good transition, because yes, America has good incentives, but why do the separatists have good incentive, and why will they want a democracy after losing all their brothers in fight and after fighting to their death? It's unclear. But why will this separatist win? These are all questions that they have to answer in order to prove any solvency on their side of the house. By the end of their speeches, if you look at your notes, they just say that all of this will succeed without proving any likelihood. The best thing about being on-side government in this debate, because of which we prefer this motion, by the way, is that there is immediate solvency that this person will step down. What happens after that is obviously better, because look at all the harms they allege upon us, none of which are true, by the way. They say there will be dynasty-based politics, oligarchs control politics, and this possible person still has his remains in politics and therefore is able to control some political power. But even in all of this, people are represented, basic services are not cut down, people can simply de-elect them if these people are bad. Look at the model at Vishwa. If there is clear understanding of what this dictator has done wrong, because after he leaves possibly there will be media coverage, it's quite likely that people will not want to elect anyone who is associated with him. It's very unclear why any of these harms will occur. But even in their best case where all these harms occur, it's still better than the situation we are in, and therefore we should win on that. But we should also win because we prove that all counterfactuals on their side of the house lead to death and destruction for people who live on the ground, and these are moral agents. These are agents who have a right to life and therefore extremely innocent, and their moral value should count in this debate too. But we should also win because we give you incentive structure as to why multiple fractions who are constantly looking for power will look at guaranteed power and be like, yes, we will get elected and rule as the chief minister of our province rather than going to fight and killing each other, and therefore leads to a good and faithful democratic transition. We also explain to you why historically all transitions that in terms of amnesty and a peaceful handover has happened in a manner, and this is exactly the political literature that is available, where you create a constituent assembly, you delegate power, and then you make sure that you bring everyone together. As long as this is the political precedence, it is likely to be followed, to which we heard absolutely no response. We have given you multiple reasons as to why the transition would be really good. Possibly a messy debate, but we win it because they don't prove solvency. There is solvency on our side. Proud of you.
Thank you to the reply speaker. Thank you for speaking today. I'd like to shake hands and one last round of